Hello and welcome to the program UFO Warning. In this episode, we're talking about the 1947 West Rindge incident. That's correct, the 1947 West Rindge incident. Now, this is another one of these UFO/flying saucer incidents that happened back in 1947. It was part of this recently released Department of War UFO files. They have released some oldies but goodies. Still haven't found anything earth-shattering, but it's fun to go across some of these. It's fun to come across some of these stories and see what people were reporting. And as far as I'm concerned, this stuff should have been released decades ago. Anyway, a pretty extensive file. I read it through AI. It says detailed summary of the declassified West Rindge, New Hampshire UFO investigation, July of 1947. The newly declassified Pentagon files provide one of the earliest documented U.S. government investigations into a mysterious event occurring during the famous Summer of the Flying Saucers in 1947. Although the files never conclude that the incident involved an extraterrestrial craft, they show that the FBI treated the event as significant enough to involve scientists at MIT, classify portions of the investigation, and forward reports directly to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Now, you have to remember 1945, I guess we're still in the Korean War. It's only been a couple years since we've dropped the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A lot of stuff going on. The timing of the incident is important. June 24th, 1947, so just the month before, pilot Kenneth Arnold reports seeing 9 unusual objects near Mount Rainier, beginning America's flying saucer craze. Newspapers nationwide begin reporting hundreds of similar sightings. Then July 7th, 1947, the West Rindge incident occurs. That's spelled R-I-N-D-G-E. On July 8th, 1947, the Roswell Army Field announces recovery of a flying disc. So you had this incident happen here, New Hampshire, on July 7th of 1947, and the very next day, we have Roswell reported. The West Rindge event unfolded during one of the most intense periods of UFO reporting in American history. Investigators were already under pressure to determine whether unusual aerial objects represented Soviet technology, secret U.S. weapons, or something else entirely. It says the date on this was July 7th, 1947 at approximately 3 p.m., West Rindge, New Hampshire, near Route 202. Retired telecommunications executive Charles N. Tasker was sitting on the porch of Earl Whitehead's home when he noticed something highly unusual. Instead of seeing an aircraft or explosion, he observed tiny curls of smoke rising from the lawn, dozens of fresh burn marks, multiple fires appearing simultaneously. The official report describes the burn spots as roughly 1.5 inches in diameter. Tasker quickly realized the smoke wasn't coming from one location. Small fires were appearing throughout the property. And that's pretty spooky, isn't it? It sounds like he just looks out there and starts seeing the smoke coming up out of his yard, but so far not seeing a craft. Investigators discovered the phenomena extending beyond Whitehead's lawn. Along Route 202, they found numerous small grass fires. Fires scattered over roughly a 200-foot circular area, burning metallic fragments lying among the fires. The local fire department extinguished the blaze before they spread. This became the primary focus of the investigation. Rather than investigating a UFO directly, authorities investigated mysterious metallic debris that appeared capable of igniting dry grass. Witnesses collected several fragments. Rather than sending them to the military immediately, the fragments were taken to researchers at MIT. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If they would have taken these to the military immediately, at some point we could have put a FOIA request in, but they didn't. They sent them to MIT. It's almost like this built-in barrier that the government had even back then. The FBI coordinated the investigation. Scientists involved included Dr. John W. Bunker, Professor Francis Regentes, an unnamed metallurgist described in FBI documents as outstanding. This is one of the unusual aspects of the case. Instead of simply filing a report, The FBI requested detailed scientific analysis. Well, sure, they wanted to get a hold of that metamaterial. They knew even back then that if this thing came from a UFO, that metal could be invaluable. MIT began determining exactly what the fragments were made of. Using spectrographic analysis, they concluded the material was ordinary iron. It had experienced extraordinarily high temperatures. Intense heat created thick oxide scaling. The scaling originally appeared unusual enough that investigators briefly questioned whether it represented an unknown alloy. Further examination showed it was simply heavily heat-damaged cast iron rather than an exotic material. Well, how did it get there? The Whitehead property sat approximately 700 to 800 feet from the railroad tracks. This immediately became investigators' leading theory. Scientists considered whether the fragments came from locomotive smokestack liners, boiler components, steam engine parts. However, this explanation presented problems. The pieces showed heating inconsistent with normal railroad equipment, and investigators ultimately ruled out nearby railroad as the likely source. Of course, in 1947, you still would have had a lot of steam engines rolling around. Could it have been from an aircraft? Attention shifted to aircraft. Of course, remember, 1947, you didn't have the jet traffic you do today. One MIT metallurgist suggested that fragments might have originated from a jet turbo aircraft. Another scientist disagreed. His reasoning was straightforward. If the fragments had fallen from a very high altitude, they would have cooled significantly before reaching the ground and would have been unlikely to ignite grass fires. To explain the observed fires, he proposed that the fragments might have broken away from a much larger object that retained enough heat during descent. Now, I don't know if he's suggesting a meteorite there or if he's really alluding to an actual UFO crash. The investigators attempted to reconstruct the original object. Based on the curvature of the recovered pieces, they concluded the fragments most likely came from a single hollow cylinder, approximately 8 inches in diameter, 3/16 of an inch thick, machine manufactured rather than naturally formed. This suggested an engineered object rather than a meteorite. That's kind of mind-blowing right there. And it kind of puts me to mind some of these orbs that we're always talking about. Goes on, it says the V2 rocket theory. One of the most intriguing sections of the files involves comparisons with the German V2 rockets. Professor J. Francis Reginis had previously observed captured V2 hardware during U.S. missile work in New Mexico. He believed the fragments resembled interior linings used in V2 rockets, cast iron cylindrical components associated with missile testing. Scientists acknowledge similarities but stopped short of identifying the fragments as V2 debris. The final report specifically states the evidence was not sufficient to exclude all other possibilities. Well, of course, you'd have to ask yourself, what would a V2 rocket be doing there in New Hampshire? Then ask why the FBI took it seriously. Several aspects of the case explain why it received attention. Physical evidence existed. Multiple witnesses observed the event. Actual fires occurred. Fragments were recovered. Laboratory testing was conducted, and findings were forwarded to FBI headquarters. Portions of the investigation were classified as a security matter. Unlike many 1947 UFO reports, this investigation centered on tangible material that could be examined scientifically. Although the reports primarily discuss metallurgy, several memoranda include handwritten references to flying disc. These annotations reflect the national concern over unexplained aerial reports only weeks after Kenneth Arnold's sighting and around the time of Roswell. They indicate that the case was at least considered within the broader context of the 1947 flying disc phenomena, even though the documents themselves do not conclude that the fragments came from a UFO. It's easy to see why people might go to that conclusion, because you have all these UFO reports and then suddenly you have this unexpected red-hot debris lighting up people's yards. What happened to the evidence? One of the most surprising details appears in the final memorandum. The Boston FBI office wrote that unless instructed otherwise, by August 15, 1947, the recovered specimens would be destroyed. The memo also stated that they would instead be sent to FBI headquarters if specifically requested. Now, that's some sketchy stuff. We've got this metamaterial. They're telling us it's iron. We don't know where it came from, but let's just go ahead and destroy it unless the FBI wants it at headquarters. That's weird. When reporters recently asked the FBI whether the fragments still exist, the Boston field office said it could not locate records showing what ultimately happened to them. As a result, it remains unclear whether the evidence was destroyed, transferred, or simply lost over time. Well, maybe they gave them back to the university there at MIT. I mean, I see no reason to destroy this stuff. The mystery has not been solved. Assessment. The declassified files does not claim that an extraterrestrial craft crashed at West Rindge. Its conclusions are more restrained. The recovered material was ordinary iron altered by extreme heat. Well, that's what MIT tells us. Okay, I haven't seen it. Investigators ruled out some mundane explanations, such as railroad equipment. They considered aircraft and V-2 rocket components as possible sources, but found the evidence insufficient to confirm either explanation. The origin of the fragments remained unresolved, leaving the event officially unexplained rather than identified as alien technology. For historians and UFO researchers, the significance of the case lies less in proving an extraterrestrial origin and more in showing that during the summer of 1947, the FBI conducted a formal, classified investigation of an unusual event involving physical evidence, scientific testing by MIT, and direct reporting to FBI headquarters. Well, what I get out of this is how the FBI came in and the government, along with MIT, was able to just circle the wagons, in effect. Take the metal into this trusted university, come back and say, well, it's just iron. We don't know where it came from. It's just iron. They create a narrative. Then the metamaterial that's been recovered, that just disappears. And the whole thing is just stamped down as inconclusive. Oh, it could have been a steam engine driving by. Oh, it could have been a 1947 airplane flying over. Just one ridiculous excuse after another. Instead of really talking about what happened here. This UFO that just showed up out of nowhere in 1947. Small, it sounds like, 8 inches across or something? Blows up. Spews hot. It must have been molten iron because it was hot enough to start grass fires everywhere. And not just right where this guy was at. It was all over the place. I mean, it sounds like within several hundred feet, you had these fires popping up. So whatever this thing was, it must have crashed high enough that it was able to disperse these molten chunks of metal all over the place. I'm lucky it didn't burn a house down or something. Really wild stuff. Let's take a look at a couple of these articles here and see if we can find a little bit more insight into this. This one here is from NHPR. It says New Hampshire, news from New Hampshire. Title says Declassified Pentagon UFO Files details mysterious 1947 incident in West Rindge. They got some of the original documents here, and you can also see those over at the Department of War website. The Pentagon released over 100 newly declassified files related to UFOs, now officially referred to as UAPs, last month, including a handful of pages and memos about mysterious flaming metal fragments that landed in a field in West Rindge in 1947, and the classified investigation that followed. This is the story of NHPR has pieced together from the incident summary sheet and official communications memos from Boston FBI field office to the director of the FBI. Begins, it says, a porch side discovery. At 3 p.m. on July 7th, 1947, retiree Charles N. Tasker was sitting on Earl Whitehead's porch in West Rindge when he observed little curls of smoke, which on inspection disclosed small burned spots about 1.5 inches in diameter on the green lawn, according to a now declassified report from the FBI. Nearby on Route 202, several little blazes had started in the long dry grass on both sides of the road, creating a circle about 200 feet in diameter that seemed to be caused by small metallic fragments, very hot metallic fragments. Tasker called the local fire department to extinguish the small fires, while a fellow observer, a Mr. Apple, gave the metallic fragments to researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to study for Dr. John W. Bunker, dean of graduate school, led the research team and reported the findings to the Boston FBI office. The first step in studying the metallic fragments was to identify what they were made of. Using a spectrograph, which studies light waves to determine the material composition of objects, scientists at MIT found the metallic fragments were of ordinary iron that had been subjected to terrific heat, which caused scales to form and thus created cast iron. Now, we see this sometimes with this UFO material. It might be an ordinary metal or an ordinary material, but oftentimes it's exposed to extreme heat, or the atoms and molecules are arranged in a certain way that would take fantastic resources. There's always some catch to it. It says, given the tasker found the metal pieces in the grass about 700 feet from a railroad track, the researchers hypothesized that the fragments could be from the liner and the smokestack or some other part of a steam engine. Well, it would seem like if they were that far away, they would have had to been blown out of there. However, further testing ruled out that theory. If not a train, then a plane, perhaps. One metallurgist at MIT speculated that fragments could be the lining from a jet turboplane. But remember, 1947, I mean, honestly, how many turboplanes do we have flying around even? But another scientist was unsure that the fragments were from an airplane, because if the fragments came from something at high altitude, most of the heat would have left by the time they reached the ground, meaning they wouldn't be able to start the fires in the grass that Tasker observed. And yet, if the iron fragments had originally been part of a larger object that fell at a great height, this large iron object would have retained enough heat to start a fire and probably would have smashed into smaller pieces upon striking the ground. I guess, in other words, if it was a meteorite, you would expect to see the core of it somewhere, wouldn't you? The scientists attempted to reconstruct this hypothetical larger object from metallic fragments, finding they had most likely been part of one hollow cylinder that was 8 inches in diameter and 3/16 of an inch thick and made using machinery. Now, they're describing this here as a cylinder, not as an orb, so that's kind of throws a little wrench in it, doesn't it? A cylinder, an 8-inch cylinder, 8 inches in diameter. So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty good size. I mean, that's the size of a good size of like a industrial water pipe or something, I suppose. Professor J. Francis Reginas, an assistant professor in electrical engineering at MIT, referred to as Rindges in the reports, thought the metallic fragments looked similar to the lining of a V-2 missile he had observed in New Mexico. In the late 1940s, the U.S. had been adapting and testing the V-2 missiles designed by Nazi Germany in World War II to study space and the Earth's atmosphere. The MIT scientists thought that cast iron cylinders of that size had been used during that research. However, that theory wasn't definitive enough to conclude the exclusion of all other possibilities, according to the final memo written to the director of the FBI. The war's been over for a couple of years and they still haven't figured out how to replicate those V-2s. Makes you wonder. A point for intelligent life beyond Earth. Even 80 years ago, extraterrestrial theories floated around. The American UFO craze had begun on June 24, 1947, when the first flying saucer observation was made in the Pacific Northwest. By June 25th, the press had picked up on an amateur pilot's report of some unidentified flying object that was then referred to as both a flying saucer and flying disc. The incident report in West Rindge is from just a few weeks later in July, with the memos to the director of the FBI from later that month. In those memos, there are several handwritten notes with flying disc written on both of them. I think people probably were really concerned about this stuff. I mean, how can you blame them? But how does this theory hold up today? I think it's great that these documents came out. I don't know if they are the smoking gun we wanted them to be, said Michael Panicello, the New England regional director of the Mutual UFO Network. Panicello, like the scientist Reginas at MIT, wondered if the metal was space debris from the V-2 rocket research happening in New Mexico. Okay, let me explain this to the fellow from Newfoundland. This is in New Hampshire, and that's going to be a couple thousand miles away from New Mexico, and I'm pretty sure that the V2 would not have been randomly shot off in that direction by the U.S. government. So that seems like quite a stretch to me. But Panicello said this doesn't make him rule out that the fragments could be a sign of extraterrestrial life. I'm not trying to be a debunker. I'm definitely not. I believe in aliens, Panicello said, but it's kind of hard to jump right to the UFO alien connection when you can't truly rule out man-made objects. I think this is why I like Newfort so much better than MUFON. You can see what I'm talking about here. First off, the reports are much easier to access. And secondly, the guy in charge of New Hampshire says we have to rule everything out. Well, I think we already have ruled everything out. It's simple to me. Something here is unexplained. Fragments of a rocket. At least one scientist thinks it is unlikely the fragments came from man-made rockets or objects launched into space simply because of the material of which they are made. There would be very little reason to make any sort of space object out of iron because its strength to weight ratio is just not as good as something like aluminum, which is practically what all spacecraft are primarily made out of these days, said James Clemens, professor of physics and astronomy at the University of New Hampshire. Clemens also found it peculiar that these metal fragments were made of cast iron, as it is not considered very strong. To me, cast iron is a very crude thing, and the idea that crude things go into space purposely is also kind of odd, Clemens said. I would have to agree with that. Can you imagine building rockets out of cast iron? I mean, that's just silly. The V-2 launches took place at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Jen Jett, a museum specialist at the White Sands Missile Range Museum in New Mexico, said via email that V-2s being launched at White Sands typically landed within the White Sands boundary within a distance of 100 miles, with the rare exceptions of landings in other parts of New Mexico and Juarez, Mexico. Considering New Hampshire is over 2,000 miles from New Mexico, it would appear there is no way for rocket debris to get anywhere close. 2,000 miles away, they have a 100-mile range, but yet we have somebody in charge of a local MUFON chapter saying, well, they could be rockets. I don't know, unless someone's letting one off in their backyard. Furthermore, V-2 rockets were made primarily of steel. While steel's main ingredient is in fact iron, the initial scientists determined the metal to be made of cast iron, which Clemens said is very different. I would expect that MIT scientists would distinguish between steel and iron, Clemens said. So if these metal fragments were not from the classified V-2 rockets, nor from the nearby railroad, what could they be? Might be a meteorite, it says. Well, according to NASA, more than 50,000 meteorites have been found on Earth. Well, most meteorites are stony. Metallic meteorites made of iron do make it to the ground on occasion. Well, I mean, this is common knowledge. However, Richard Benzel, a professor of planetary science at MIT, said the written accounts were not consistent with meteorites. Meteorites do not arrive hot when they land and would not spark a fire, Benzel said. While there are iron meteorites, their metal composition is distinctive, and the early analysis would have immediately declared the fragments as meteorites. Well, there you go. I guess that solves that one. Goes on, it says, where are the fragments now? The final memo to the director of the FBI in the recently released file stated that unless advised to the contrary, by August 15, 1947, the Boston office will destroy these specimens. In the interim, they will be transmitted to the Bureau on specific Bureau instructions. It hasn't even been just barely a month, and you're going to destroy these things already? This has got cover-up written all over it. NHPR contacted the Boston field office of the FBI to confirm whether the metal fragments had been destroyed. In response, the Boston field office said, at this point in time, we haven't been able to locate any records responsive to your request. Yeah, I think I could have predicted that. This isn't New Hampshire's only potential encounter with extraterrestrials. In 1961, Portsmouth resident Betty and Barney Hill famously had one of the first alleged UFO abduction encounters in the country, and Exeter has an annual UFO festival revolving around a famed 1965 incident nearby. Sounds like kind of a repeat encounters here, huh? As for the mystery metal from West Rindge, theories about rocket debris and meteorites have come up short of solid evidence. For now, no one can conclusively determine the origins of the cast iron fragments near Route 202. This unidentified anomalous phenomenon remains a mystery left unsolved. Here's the problem, kids. Chain of custody. Where did this stuff end up at? we had one university that works for the government. Of course, we've talked about MIT's connections to the deep state in the past. And we're supposed to believe that they just are to be trusted to have tested the stuff, come up with this mundane explanation, gave the metamaterial back to the government to be destroyed within a couple of weeks by August 15th. And I think what the sighting happened on July there. So in less than 6 weeks later, everything's destroyed, and we're just supposed to believe it when we're told nothing to see here, move along. This seems to me to be the classic way that the government does handle and has handled UFO sightings, UFO encounters, and recovered UFO metamaterial. You send the team in, you send the FBI in, you collude with a big university or a third-party contractor. They come back and say, nope, nothing to see here. We can't explain it, but it's definitely not a UFO. Oh, by the way, the metamaterial, the evidence has been lost. The evidence is top secret. Nobody can talk about it. Nothing to see here. Sheep, go back to eating grass. That is just the game plan that we see done with these things over and over and over again. And I hope that if we don't get anything else out of these files that have been released, that we can see the pattern of this almost like a passive cover-up. That's the disclosure we're getting. The disclosure is that we're not getting disclosure, that we've never gotten disclosure, and we're probably never going to get it. If you want disclosure, like I've always said, you're going to have to get it yourself. Go outside, look up. Until next time, this is UFO Warning, over and out.